If you had to rely entirely on the natural physics of simple diffusion, like just letting oxygen passively drift from your lungs through your tissue and all the way down your legs.
Right, just sort of floating down there.
Exactly. It's estimated that it would take roughly 3 years for a single breath to reach your toes.
Which is, I mean, obviously by that point, the cells in your feet would have long since died of asphyxiation, right? Biology simply cannot wait around for passive physics.
Yeah, it really can't.
It has to, engineer these incredibly aggressive workarounds just to keep you functioning day to day.
Which, honestly, is the perfect entry point for our deep dive today. Welcome, everybody. Today we are looking at a foundational science text covering life processes.
A really fascinating set of source materials.
Truly. And our mission today is to dive into this text and answer a question that, well, it seems completely obvious at first, but it gets incredibly weird the closer you look at it. And that question is, what exactly makes you, the listener, quote-unquote, alive right at this very second?
Right, because we all carry around this intuitive bias about what life looks like.
We totally do.
We look for visible movement, a dog running, a person walking, or even the slow, time-lapsed growth of a plant.
Yeah, the visible stuff.
Exactly. But the source text strips all of that away. The defining characteristic of life, according to this, isn't visible movement at all. It is this chaotic, invisible molecular hustle happening constantly inside the organism.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because even if you are sitting perfectly still right now, listening to us, maybe you're resting your eyes, your heart rate is completely calm. You are burning through an immense amount of energy just to, well, maintain your physical form.
Oh, absolutely. Because your physical form is essentially a massive anomaly.
Right.
Living things are these highly ordered, incredibly complex structures. You've got cells, tissues, organ systems. But the universe naturally favors entropy.
Right, it wants chaos.
Yes. The natural environment is just constantly battering that order, trying to break it down. So to prevent your molecular structure from just degrading into dust, you have to actively fight that breakdown. You're constantly synthesizing new proteins, repairing cell walls, moving molecules around.
And that molecular maintenance is the absolute baseline of being alive. The text even notes that this is so defining, it's actually the crux of the whole debate around viruses.
Oh, yeah, the virus edge case. That's a great point.
Right, because viruses don't have any internal molecular movement of their own. They are completely inert until they physically hijack a host cell's machinery, which, makes them this bizarre middle ground between a living organism and just a complex piece of floating chemistry.
Exactly. And the moment that internal maintenance stops for any of us, the organism succumbs to the environment. The order just breaks down.
It's game over.
Pretty much. But to perform that maintenance, to physically synthesize new cellular structures, you need raw materials and you need fuel.
Which brings us to the first massive logistical hurdle biology has to clear, which is nutrition. Because you can't rebuild a crumbling brick wall without importing new bricks from the outside, right?
You definitely cannot.
So for carbon-based life forms, that means acquiring carbon from the environment. And the text points out that autotrophs, like green plants, they have this incredibly elegant solution.
They really do. It's so clean.
Right. They just pull simple, inorganic compounds like carbon dioxide and water directly from the air and soil. And then using chlorophyll, they capture the kinetic energy of sunlight and use it to literally forge the chemical bonds to build complex carbohydrates.
They are essentially manufacturing their own structure from scratch.
Yeah, just pulling it out of thin air.
Literally.
Yeah.
But then you have heterotrophs, animals, fungi, humans. We have a much, much messier approach.
Oh, way messier.
We can't build from inorganic basics like plants do. We have to consume complex, pre-built carbon structures, meaning other plants or animals, and then totally dismantle them into modular pieces that our bodies can actually absorb.
And this is where digestion comes in. When you look at the mechanics of the human alimentary canal, it is just a marvel of chemical engineering.
It's unbelievable.
You take a bite of food and your saliva immediately goes to work. It's got this stuff called salivary amylase, which is an enzyme that targets complex starches.
Yeah.
But enzymes aren't just like chemical hammer smashing things.
Oh, no, they're much more precise than that.
Yeah, they work by temporarily binding to the starch molecule and physically contorting it. It lowers the activation energy you need to snap the chemical bonds, breaking the food down into simple sugars.
And that chemical dismantling only gets more aggressive as the food moves down the esophagus. It
Right.
uses these peristaltic muscle contractions to push into the stomach, and the stomach is a seriously hostile environment by design.
Totally.
The gastric glands are secreting hydrochloric acid right alongside a protein-digesting enzyme called pepsin.
Which is wild because the text mentions the stomach lining actually has to constantly secrete mucus just to prevent the acid from digesting the stomach itself.
Yeah, you're literally protecting yourself from your own biology.
Right. But the acid isn't just there to randomly dissolve things.
Mm-hmm.
It actually serves a very specific mechanical purpose for that pepsin enzyme.
Right, because proteins are these very complex, tightly folded 3D molecules.
They're like tangled up yarn.
Exactly. So if pepsin just bumped into a folded protein, it couldn't get to the interior bonds to break them. The hydrochloric acid drops the pH so drastically that the protein molecules denature. They physically unwind and stretch out.
Wow.
And once it's unspooled like that, the pepsin can easily sweep in and just snip the exposed peptide bonds, chopping the whole thing into manageable amino acids.
But then, right after that,
Yeah.
the body faces this major chemical dilemma because that mixture is super acidic when it leaves the stomach and enters the small intestine. But the pancreatic enzymes waiting in the small intestine, they require an alkaline environment to function.
Right, they can't work in acid.
No.
Huh.
So the body has to instantly flip the pH.
And the liver handles that by secreting bile. The bile neutralizes the acid, but it also solves a very physical problem with fats.
The dish soap thing, right?
Yes, because dietary fats naturally clump together into these large hydrophobic globules in the intestine. They hate water.
Right, oil and water don't mix.
Exactly. So the water-based enzymes can only attack the very outside surface of those fat spheres, which makes fat digestion incredibly slow. But bile salts act as an emulsifier.
It's literally the exact same chemical mechanism as using dish soap on a greasy pan in your sink.
That is exactly what it is. The bile salts have one end that loves water and one end that loves fat. They wedge themselves into the fat globules and force them to break apart into thousands of tiny droplets.
Which massively increases the total surface area.
Precisely. It lets the pancreatic lipases rapidly dismantle the lipids.
And the physical design of the small intestine itself is also adapted to what kind of chemical bonds an animal is trying to break, right? Like herbivores eat grass, which is just packed with cellulose.
Which is incredibly hard to break down.
Yeah, the beta-acetyl linkages in cellulose require prolonged bacterial fermentation. Because of that, herbivores evolve significantly longer small intestines to give the food enough transit time to actually degrade.
Whereas carnivores are processing meat, which breaks down a lot faster, so their small intestines are relatively short.
Makes total sense. But whatever the length, the ultimate goal of the small intestine is absorption. The inner lining is heavily corrugated, and it's covered in these microscopic finger-like projections called villi.
The villi are crucial.
Yeah, they multiply the internal surface area exponentially. So the dismantled molecules, the amino acids, the simple sugars, they're finally small enough to cross the cellular membrane of the villi and enter the dense network of blood vessels waiting underneath.
So if we connect this to the bigger picture, depending on the organism's evolutionary strategy, whether it's a stationary plant pulling energy from the sun or a mobile predator hunting for proteins, the physical apparatus looks very different.
But the objective is identical.
Exactly. Take chaotic external matter and reduce it to a uniform, usable energy source that can circulate inside the organism.
And here's the catch. Getting those amino acids and glucose molecules into the bloodstream is really only solving half the equation.
Right.
You have the raw fuel, but fuel doesn't actually do any work until you ignite it.
Right.
Like having a full tank of gasoline doesn't make your car move unless you have an engine to combust it.
And for a biological cell, that engine is respiration.
Respiration.
It's the precise chemical dismantling of that absorbed food to harvest its stored energy. And step one is pretty much universal across all life. In the fluid cytoplasm of the cell, the 6-carbon glucose molecule gets broken in half.
Right, the 3-carbon molecule.
Yeah, called pyruvate.
And how the cell proceeds from there totally depends on whether oxygen is present. Like if you were doing a sudden, intense physical activity, say you're sprinting to catch a train, your cardiovascular system might not be able to deliver oxygen to your leg muscles fast enough.
The demand is just too high.
Yeah. But the muscle cells don't just shut down. They pivot to an anaerobic pathway. They break down the pyruvate without oxygen, which produces lactic acid as a byproduct.
And that anaerobic pathway is really just a survival mechanism. It's a dirty, inefficient burn that yields very little energy, but it keeps the cell from dying in a crisis.
But the buildup of that lactic acid, that's what physically causes the sharp cramping in your muscles when you work out too hard, right?
Exactly. To achieve the massive sustained energy output required for complex life, you need the aerobic pathway, which uses oxygen and takes place inside the mitochondria.
So by bringing oxygen into the equation, the cell completely shatters the three-carbon pyruvate molecule into carbon dioxide and water. And the energy released from snapping those bonds is captured to synthesize ATP.
ATP, adenosine triphosphate. It is the primary energy currency of the organism.
The battery.
Yes. And the mechanism of ATP is just fascinating. The molecule has 3 phosphate groups attached to it. Now, phosphates are highly negatively charged, which means they naturally repel each other.
Like trying to push two wrong ends of a magnet together.
Perfect analogy. Forcing that third phosphate group onto the tail of the molecule requires a significant amount of energy, and it creates this highly unstable, tightly coiled chemical spring.
So when a muscle needs to contract, or like a neuron needs to fire in your brain, the cell uses water to sever that terminal phosphate bond. Snapping that compressed spring releases a highly precise burst of energy.
Exactly 30.5 kilojoules per mole.
Wow.
Every single time. It is a completely standardized, universally compatible power source for every cellular mechanism you have.
But to continuously synthesize ATP at the scale required to keep a human alive, the demand for oxygen is staggering, which, the text notes, presents a really unique challenge for aquatic life.
It's a huge problem for fish.
Yeah, because the concentration of dissolved oxygen in water is incredibly low compared to the roughly 21% oxygen concentration we have in the atmosphere.
Right. Consequently, fish have to constantly force water over their gills at a super rapid rate, filtering the water just to extract the bare minimum oxygen they need to survive.
Which makes me wonder, actually, wait, if plants make their own food through photosynthesis, do they even need to, quote-unquote, breathe like we do?
Oh, that's a great question. And yes, they absolutely do. They exchange gases through tiny pores called stomata.
Okay, so how does that work with the photosynthesis?
Well, during the day, they use the CO2 they generate for photosynthesis and release oxygen. But at night, when there's no sunlight, photosynthesis stops. So CO2 elimination actually becomes their major gas exchange activity, just like us.
That's wild. They switch depending on the sun.
They do. Now, terrestrial animals like us, we don't have to filter water, but we still face the physical problem of getting a gas from the air into a liquid bloodstream.
Right.
Our evolutionary solution is the lung, which is basically a masterclass in maximizing surface area.
Oh, yeah. The air passages divide and subdivide into these microscopic balloon-like sacs called alveoli, which are wrapped in a mesh of blood capillaries.
Because the physics of gas exchange require a massive, most surface layer.
The math on this is crazy. If you were to unfold all the alveoli in an adult human's lungs and lay them completely flat, the tissue would cover about 80 square meters.
It's hard to even picture.
You are literally walking around with a biological membrane roughly the size of a tennis court neatly compacted inside your rib cage.
It's incredible. But having a tennis court of oxygen in your chest brings us right back to the problem we mentioned at the very beginning of the deep dive.
The 3-year diffusion problem.
Exactly. The oxygen is in your lungs, but the ATP synthesis is happening down in your toes. The fuel from your intestines is in your gut, but your brain cells need it to fire. You need an aggressive, high-speed logistics network to bypass that slow crawl of simple diffusion.
And this is where the transportation system comes in. It's built around a specialized respiratory pigment called hemoglobin. It's a complex protein packed inside our red blood cells, and it contains iron atoms.
And here's where it gets really interesting. When blood passes through the capillaries of the alveoli, oxygen molecules bind directly to that iron.
Like rust, basically.
Sort of, yeah. But the brilliance of hemoglobin is this concept called cooperativity. The moment the very first oxygen molecule binds to it, the protein actually physically changes its shape.
Wow.
And that shape change exposes the other iron sites, dramatically increasing its affinity to grab more oxygen. It actively, aggressively loads itself with cargo.
It's like it gets hungrier the more it eats.
That's a great way to put it.
But hemoglobin obviously doesn't move on its own. It needs a pump. And the human heart is this highly specialized 4-chambered muscle.
It's quite the machine.
Yeah. The right side receives the oxygen-depleted carbon dioxide heavy blood from the body and pumps it to the lungs. And then the left side receives that freshly oxygenated blood back from the lungs and violently contracts to push it out through the entire vascular network.
And this double circulation system is an absolute thermodynamic requirement for warm-blooded animals like mammals and birds.
Because of the heat.
Exactly. We expend a massive amount of ATP simply maintaining our internal body temperature. We cannot afford any inefficiency.
Right, no mixed signals.
Right. The four-chambered design ensures that oxygen-rich blood and carbon dioxide-rich blood literally never mix. Amphibians and reptiles, because they tolerate a wider range of body temperatures, they only have three chambers.
So they get a little mixing.
Yeah, a bit of mixing. And fish make do with just two chambers, pumping blood to the gills and then straight out to the body in a single lower pressure loop.
But for us, generating the force to push blood through miles and miles of human vascular tissue requires extreme pressure.
High-pressure plumbing.
Exactly. The thick, elastic walls of our arteries have to withstand the systolic pressure, which is the maximum force when the heart's ventricles contract, and they have to maintain tension during the diastolic pressure when the heart relaxes.
Which is what we measure with a sphygmomanometer.
The blood pressure cuff at the doctor's office.
Exactly. We're usually looking for that baseline of 120/80.
So the human cardiovascular system relies entirely on muscular force and high pressure. But I love how the text contrasts that with plant transportation, because a redwood tree can be hundreds of feet tall, right?
Oh, absolutely towering.
It has to transport water from the deep soil all the way to the uppermost canopy, but it has no heart. It has no muscles. It uses an entirely different physical phenomenon.
Plants rely on two separate conductive tissues. The phloem moves the synthesized sugars from the leaves down to the roots.
It's translocation, right?
Yes, translocation, which actually costs the plant ATP energy to perform. But the water transport, which happens in the xylem, relies entirely on the sun.
This part is so cool.
It really is. The xylem is composed of dead, hollowed-out cells that form a continuous tube from the roots all the way to the leaves. And on the underside of those leaves are those tiny pores we mentioned, the stomata.
Right, taking in the CO2.
When they open to take in carbon dioxide, water vapor naturally escapes into the air. That's a process called transpiration.
And because water molecules are polar, they exhibit cohesion. Basically, they like to stick to one another.
Right.
So as the sun's heat evaporates one water molecule from the leaf, the physical tension of that evaporation physically pulls the next water molecule up right behind it.
It creates an unbroken microscopic cable of water stretching hundreds of feet down into the soil. The sun is essentially just hauling the water up the tree.
It's a totally passive, silent process that moves literally tons of water every single day.
And when you compare that to our human system, being highly pressurized and completely dependent on containing a specific liquid volume, we are so much more vulnerable to catastrophic failure.
Oh yeah. A severed plant stem just loses a branch. A severed human artery could depressurize your entire system.
Which is why the blood carries an automated repair crew, your platelets. If the endothelial lining of a blood vessel is torn, platelets immediately adhere to the exposed tissue.
They just stick right to the wound.
Yeah, and they trigger a chemical cascade that forms a web of fibrin, physically clotting the blood and plucking the leak.
Plus, we have the lymphatic system. Because the massive hydrostatic pressure required to force blood into your microscopic capillary beds means that fluid, your blood plasma, is actually constantly being pushed out through the thin capillary walls and into your surrounding tissues.
Right, you're constantly leaking internally.
Yeah, and if left alone, we would just rapidly swell up and lose all our blood volume. So the body utilizes this parallel drainage network, the lymphatic system, to collect that escaped plasma and return it to the major veins.
It's all about maintaining that fluid equilibrium.
So if we trace the journey so far, the organism has broken down complex carbon structures, absorbed the molecules, pumped them through miles of vascular tubing, flooded them with oxygen to break the bonds, and captured the energy in ATP to fight cellular decay.
That is a lot of work.
It is. But burning fuel always produces exhaust. Synthesizing proteins and utilizing ATP naturally generates metabolic byproducts.
Specifically, breaking down proteins generates nitrogenous wastes, like urea and uric acid. And these compounds are highly toxic.
Right, you can't just leave them floating around.
No, if they accumulate, they alter the pH of the blood, they interfere with enzymatic reactions, and they rapidly kill cells. So excretion is the final, non-negotiable life process. You absolutely must take out the chemical trash.
And in humans, this incredibly important task falls to the kidneys. The functional unit of the kidney is a microscopic structure called a nephron. and each kidney contains about 1 million of them.
A million in each one.
Yeah. At the start of a nephron is this cup-shaped structure called Bowman's capsule, and it wraps around a dense knot of capillaries.
And the filtration mechanism here relies on sheer brute force.
Really?
Yeah, the blood enters that capillary knot under very high hydrostatic pressure. This literally forces water, salts, glucose, amino acids, and the toxic urea right out through the thin capillary walls and into the capsule.
So it just squeezes everything out.
Entirely non-selective. Anything small enough to pass through the membrane just gets pushed out into the initial filtrate.
And the scale of this brute force filtration is astonishing. A healthy pair of human kidneys forces about 180 liters of fluid out of the blood every single day. That's nearly 50 gallons of liquid.
Which raises an important question, right?
Yeah, wait, 180 liters? That's dozens of gallons a day. Why does the body go through all the trouble of filtering so much liquid just to absorb like 99% of it right back into the blood?
Right, because obviously if we excreted 180 liters of urine a day, we would be dead in hours.
Right. We only excrete about 1 to 2 liters.
Exactly. The vast majority of that initial filtrate, the water, the essential salts, all that valuable glucose and amino acids, it has to be reclaimed.
Right, so why dump it all in the first place?
The elegance of dumping everything out and then selectively rescuing what you need is that it provides absolute dynamic control over your internal environment.
Oh, I see.
Yeah. If you consume heavily salted food one day, the nephrons simply rescue less salt, allowing the excess to just pass into the urine.
And if you're severely dehydrated?
Then hormonal signals cause the nephron to reabsorb nearly all the water, deeply concentrating your urine just to preserve your blood volume.
It's a real-time chemical balancing act.
It is. The cells lining the nephron tube use active transport to pump the valuable glucose and sodium back into the surrounding blood vessels. Because the salt concentration in the blood is now higher, water naturally follows via osmosis, pulling the fluid back into the circulatory system.
And it leaves only the concentrated urea behind.
Exactly. And when the kidneys fail, that precise balance is just destroyed.
Which is why hemodialysis is necessary. In dialysis, an artificial kidney is used. The patient's blood is routed through selectively permeable tubes bathed in a dialyzing fluid.
Right, and the urea passively diffuses out of the blood across the concentration gradient.
It keeps the patient alive, sure, but dialysis relies strictly on passive diffusion. It cannot perform the active, selective reabsorption and dynamic fluid balancing of a natural human nephron.
It's a lifesaver, but it's not nearly as elegant as biology. And, plants also face an excretion problem, though their solutions really reflect their stationary, slower metabolic nature.
Right, they aren't pumping blood at high pressure.
No. Plants can afford to store toxic byproducts in the large vacuoles of their cells, or they just isolate them in leaves that will eventually wither and drop off.
Oh, so a falling leaf is actually a form of excretion.
Basically, yeah. They also synthesize waste into resins and gums, depositing them in old, inactive xylem tissue right in the core of the tree. They can even excrete certain compounds directly out through their roots into the surrounding soil.
So if we step back and look at the scope of all this biological machinery we've talked about today, we began by asking what it means to be alive at this exact second.
Right.
And it clearly goes so far beyond just having a pulse or taking a breath. Your physical existence right now, as you listen to this, is a triumph of molecular engineering.
It really is.
Millions of times a second, you are unraveling complex proteins with stomach acid. You're expanding surface areas to absorb carbon. You're utilizing cooperativity and iron-based proteins to aggressively steal oxygen from the atmosphere.
And actively breaking compressed phosphate bonds to power the high-pressure filtration of your own toxic waste.
All of this happening silently, invisibly, just to maintain the order of your cells against a universe that inherently wants to tear them apart.
The sheer scale of coordination is really humbling. And, I want to leave you with a final thought, something stemming directly from the text's explanation of plant excretion.
Oh, yeah, this blew my mind.
We discussed how organisms have to eliminate their toxic metabolic byproducts, right? Well, for a plant, utilizing water and carbon dioxide during photosynthesis creates a distinct waste product. It's a gas that the plant absolutely must expel to maintain its own internal chemistry.
And that waste product is oxygen.
Exactly. The next time you walk past a tree, just consider the relationship there. The oxygen that your hemoglobin is so aggressively stripping from the air, the exact molecule you require to ignite the pyruvate in your cells and synthesize the ATP that keeps your heart pumping, that molecule is literally a plant's metabolic trash.
Wow.
Your complex, warm-blooded, highly pressurized survival relies entirely on inhaling the global ecosystem's exhaust.
That is just totally wild to think about. Every single breath you take to fight off your own molecular decay is powered by the waste of a silent, sun-powered water pump. Well, that's all for today. Take care, everyone, and we'll see you on the next deep dive.